Do Mi'kmaq store owners have the right to sell cannabis outside Nova Scotia's regulated system? That's a question that is coming to a head as a number of store operators face charges and vow to fight them. Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution recognizes and affirms existing treaty and Aboriginal rights. When we think of treaty rights in Nova Scotia, we typically think of the fisheries. Mi'kmaq have asserted, for instance, they have a right to earn a moderate livelihood from the lobster fishery, following a landmark 1999 Supreme Court of Canada decision. But does that right extend to cannabis? In Nova Scotia, only the Crown Corporation known as the NSLC has been permitted by the province to sell cannabis. But that hasn't stopped the proliferation of unauthorized stores. Some Mi'kmaq operators charged with cannabis offences are relying, at least in part, on the Peace and Friendship Treaty of 1752. It was signed between a Mi'kmaq chief and the British governor of Nova Scotia. Here's part of it. And that, in the meantime, the said Indians shall have free liberty to bring for sale to Halifax or any other settlement within this province skins, feathers, fowl, fish, or any other thing they shall have to sell, where they shall have liberty to dispose thereof to the best advantage. So, does that free liberty to sell include cannabis? Well, according to a legal brief filed last year by a federal prosecutor in one of these cases, a treaty right to trade only involves items and commodities that were actually traded before the treaty was signed or were reasonably contemplated at the time. Under a nearly 3-decade-old Supreme Court of Canada decision, it's even harder to prove an Aboriginal right. That's because the test laid out by the High Court says defendants must show that the practice, custom, or tradition existed before European contact, that it was integral to a community's way of life, and that the modern right has a reasonable degree of continuity with the practice of the past. In short, the cases before the Nova Scotia courts could come down to a crucial question. Did historic Mi'kmaq communities trade in cannabis? That is hardly clear. Some historians have pointed to the early 1600s as the first time cannabis in the form of hemp used in rope and clothing was planted in Nova Scotia. This was done by a French apothecary. That said, there is evidence that cannabis was growing wild in parts of North America. Some Mi'kmaq store owners have noted cannabis is a plant, one that can be used for medicinal purposes, and the Mi'kmaq have long used plants as medicine. Even so, using that to prove a right to sell cannabis today, that's likely an uphill climb. The Aboriginal rights test laid out by the Supreme Court, which focuses on what happened before European contact, it's been criticized for setting too high a bar. It's very difficult to prove. It's also been criticized for not recognizing that practices and customs, they evolve. And there are indigenous law observers who hope the test will change. And maybe it will one day if the Supreme Court weighs back in.